First up is Jay Faulkner. He is a writer, a martial artist, a para-archer, a sketcher and dreamer, but most importantly, a husband and father. He lives with, but refuses to suffer from myasthenia. I always wonder if I pronounce that right. And spina bifida. He writes and publishes speculative science fiction, fantasy and dark fiction. And sometimes he even sleeps. We're delighted to listen to him read Hero Worship.
Thank you. A gust of wind hit him. The cape whipped around, wrapping across his face, blinding him. He stumbled back, losing the carefully designed pose he'd been holding. Hours spent practicing in front of the mirror until it was perfect, until it was just like his, ruined. He muttered to himself as he pulled the long trailing red fabric back and let it settle around him. He hadn't factored in the wind when training at home. He should have got a fan, one of the large industrial ones, if his mum would have let him. Sure, the basement was his place, his domain, but it was still her house. She never let him forget that. The wind hit him again and he shivered. He hadn't realised how cold it got this high up. He didn't go out much, preferring to spend his time in his room with his games and comics. Other than the weekly pilgrimage to Beyond Comics and the monthly haul to the doctors and therapists with his mother. At those times he was dressed as his other, in jackets and scarves and hats, like his mother enforced. Up here he was himself. He wore what he wanted. He looked down and smiled. The all-in-one leotard fitted him from his neck to ankles and shone a bright blue. He traced his hand around the symbol on his chest. He'd thought about sewing it on, but, after the first attempt, when there were more holes in his fingers and stitches in the material, he'd given up. The logo he'd drawn in red and yellow Sharpies had turned out okay. It was just like his. He sucked in his stomach, holding his breath, and smiled again at the result. He looked great. He looked awesome. The scream interrupted his thoughts. Peering over the parapet, he saw two men pulling a woman into an alleyway, across the street from his perch at the top of the 5-story building. A glint of silver. A knife? He hit the pose. The cape streamed out behind him. He smiled. It was time. He launched himself from the roof. The cold air was invigorating as it raced across his skin, pulling his face into a rictus-like grin. The cape billowed out behind him, a streak of crimson in the sky. He pushed one fist forwards, aiming it dead ahead at the men attacking the woman. It was happening, finally happening. He would save her, save the day, be a hero. He would... Metal, glass, bone, and blood exploded across the street as he impacted on the roof of the car, crushing it with the sound of thunder. The cape fluttered down, landing gently across his body. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the car alarm blared to life and lights started flashing. The woman fell to her knees, screamed. The two men stared in disbelief at the carnage. One threw up. The other grabbed him, pulled him upright, then, together, turned and ran into the alleyway. Later, crowds were held at bay by yellow tape. Photographers took pictures of every angle of the scene. Of the rooftop, of the discarded knife, of the broken glass and bits of metal on the street, of the broken body on the roof of the car, and the shards of bone that protruded from limbs at bent and grotesque angles. The woman sat numbly on the curb, a blanket draped across her shoulders. A disposable cup streamed in a hand, ignored. Near her, two cops stared at the car, at the body on top of it. "Well, I'd give him 6 points for artistic merit," one said to a male colleague. "But a big fat 0 for the landing." "Oh, I'm not sure," he replied, looking from rooftop to the car. "Looks like he nailed it to me." Stop. Barely above a whisper, raw, pained, quiet. But they heard it. They looked down to see the woman staring at them, her face streaked with tears. Stop it. She got to her feet, the blanket hanging loosely from her shoulder. "Stop joking about him." "We're sorry, ma'am. I know," the male cop started to say. No, you don't know, she interrupted with force. Nearby cops turned at the commotion. People behind the yellow line stared. Cameras clicked and flashed. They had a knife. They said they were going to hurt me. That they were going to... She choked up, stopped talking, tried to look at the car, at the body, but started to shake and couldn't. She looked up at the roof instead. The wind picked up and the blanket swirled gently around her. He stopped them, she said finally, to herself or to the cops. It no longer mattered. He saved me. He was a hero. Pulling the blanket tight around her body, she allowed the tears to stream freely as she remembered the words she'd heard shouted from the roof moments before the plummeting body had interrupted her attackers, had saved her. She whispered them to herself, keeping them close as she sank to the ground again. Up, and... Thank you.